What you're about to see is a matter of human record. Explain it? We cannot. Disprove it? We cannot. We simply invite you to explore with us the amazing world of the unknown. To take that one step beyond.
From the City of Angels near the Pacific Ocean, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie. Welcome to this remarkable program we call Coast to Coast AM. Later tonight, the quest to find Atlantis. Here's what's happening. You might recall that story we had last night, a very sad story. The little baby found dangling in her car seat, upside down in a riverbed. The mother was dead. Well, there's more to that story, and listen to this. As 4 Utah police officers approached an overturned car discovered below a bridge in an icy river, they heard a woman's voice asking softly for help. Now, when the foursome flipped over the mid-sized car, they discovered the 25-year-old Lynn Grossbeck dead in the front seat. The only other passenger, the 18-month-old little girl in the back seat, unconscious but alive. A firefighter jumped into the river, cut the straps. The baby girl, who was wearing only a flannel pajama, no hat, no gloves, was rescued. Officers then formed a line in the river. They handed the little cold child to one another until she got to the shoreline, and then they put her in an ambulance and performed CPR, took her to the hospital in critical condition. She's now stable, improving, opening her eyes. They say doing well. But nobody knows exactly how the infant survived hanging upside down for 14 hours. And nobody knows for sure where that voice of help came from. Was it the mother before she passed on? Or was it the voice from someplace else? Well, in a moment, psychic Mark Anthony joins us as we talk about his work on the other side. About 3,000 U.S. soldiers from the Georgia-based 3rd Infantry Division will deploy to Eastern Europe beginning next week. Hold on now. It's to conduct training exercises with forces from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The deployment is part of an ongoing U.S. military troop rotation aimed at bolstering support for NATO allies who are worried about escalating aggression by Russia. A 12-year-old Cairo, Egypt student has been beaten to death by his teacher for not doing his homework. The boy died Sunday after being beaten by a teacher the previous day. So far, the teacher has been suspended from school. Would you spend $17,000 for a wristwatch? I wouldn't. Apple's smartwatch collection will range in price from $349 to $17,000, depending on the metals that are made from and the straps that they are bought with. Apple also revealed that these devices are due to go on sale on April 24th. Lauren Weinstein, our expert on technology, with us. Lauren, first of all, what's this watch going to be able to do?
Well, that's a very interesting question. It's also fascinating how this announcement today did not really generate the kind of attention that most Apple announcements attract, probably because there are already other smartwatches. There's Android. There's other smartwatches that have already been announced and are already out there. What can the watches do? Well, really, these watches at this stage of the game are peripherals for your smartphone.
It's Dick Tracy all over again.
Yeah, except with a lot less capability in some ways, because I doubt that Dick Tracy had to be constantly recharging that wrist radio, or half the time when he needed it would have been dead. That's one of the big problems with this type of technology. These watches is right now we just don't have the battery technology to have something that's reasonable to strap on your wrist without making you look like Conan the Barbarian with a wristlet or something that will last more than a day, or sometimes much less than a day. Plus, they aren't really independent devices. To really do anything useful in terms of communication or messages, they have to be linked to a smartphone that's also turned on and fully charged, or at least operational at that point. So you have a lot of technology there that has to interoperate. And I think what we're looking at here is a segment of technology, wearable technology, that will ultimately be a gigantic thing. It will.
You think so? You think it's going to just
eventually it will evolve. We'll have super battery technology. We'll have ways for these things to operate independently. They'll just be the size of an ordinary wristwatch, and they'll do amazing things. But right now we're sort of at that bleeding edge of technology, where it's all very new, and for people who are first adopters who are willing to spend between, like you said, $349 to $17,000 for a wristwatch, they can play with them. But I think for a lot of people, it's going to be kind of a wait-and-see technology that they're not going to want to jump into quite yet, but keep their eye on what it's doing.
Is it going to cut new market share for Apple?
I suppose it'll do some, but I suspect that it's going to probably most appeal to people that are already in the Apple ecosystem one way or another, because it really wants to talk to an iPhone. Those Apple Watches really want to be linked to an iPhone. So if you don't have an iPhone, it's probably going to be a much less attractive proposition.
Would you buy one?
No.
Okay.
not at this point. I really don't have a need for it. I'm watching. I'm hoping that some years down the line that this technology will evolve in fantastic ways. But it's like any other technology. It starts off kind of slow and in more limited fashions, and sometimes it takes off and sometimes it doesn't. So we keep our fingers crossed.
Sam Simon, co-creator of Fox's long-running hit animated series The Simpsons and a philanthropist for animals. He's died after a battle with colon cancer. He's only 59 years old. Simon won 9 Emmys for his work as a writer, executive producer of The Simpsons, the situation comedy that premiered back in 1989, won over a global audience with the portrait of a bumbling father and his wayward family. Sam Simon dead at the age of 59. Solar flares, a sunspot AR2297 has erupted a few days ago, producing a very powerful solar flare, but it was almost an X-flare, but it went the other way. It did not hit us. We lucked out there. Let's check in with Dr. Sky, Stephen Cates. It's only a matter of time, Stephen. You know that.
Absolutely, George. You were so correct. AR2297, about 4 times in the last few days, has produced these M-class flares on the sun, which, to give everybody a good understanding, as you mentioned, the X-flares, well up into the 20s and 30s are the super dangerous kind. But what's very interesting about this, the sun looks almost spotless at this point, George, other than AR2297 on the disk of the sun. But this is something very interesting that people need to know, that deep within the sun's core, of course, the areas where these sunspot and flare groups are, looking to start and continue, I guess, George, we've been talking about it for so long, it's not a matter of if, it is definitely a matter of when. And astronomers are saying that this cycle of the sunspot cycle that we're in right now is not obviously completely over. Something important that people need to know, large radio blackouts occurred here on the Earth for people in the Pacific Ocean area. For ham radio operators, they know all too well about this, and particularly one last week, George, over the whole area, the continent of South America. So something we need to watch very closely. The sun is obviously an object that's a living, breathing mechanism, a fusion-powered reactor. And to close, I just wanted to remind our listeners here on Coast, George, go to drsky.com for our continuing coverage of the Dawn spacecraft mission, the asteroid series. Hopefully in a week or two, George, we'll get some better images.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that amazing, those bright
sure
spots that seemingly glow? And check photorecon.net for our aviation site. Always a pleasure, George, to talk about the wonders of astronomy, space, aviation, and weather.
You too. It's really, he is so excited about astronomy. He just makes it fun. In a moment, evidence for eternity, communicating with spirits for proof of the afterlife. Mark Anthony joins us on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast to Coast. Mark Anthony is a nationally recognized person as a paranormal expert and legal analyst in high-profile criminal cases. Now, this is interesting. He's a world-renowned fourth-generation psychic medium. He communicates with spirits. He's also an Oxford-educated attorney, licensed to practice law in Florida, D.C., and before the United States Supreme Court. His works include Evidence of Eternity and Never Letting Go, 2 separate books. Mark Anthony, back on Coast to Coast. Mark, welcome to the program.
Thank you, George. It's great to be back.
The story I had at the top of the show about that little girl that was rescued, but the police officers and technicians who got on the scene swear that they heard a voice. Now, first thing I thought when I heard that was, oh, my God, the mother was still alive, and she's crying for help. I don't think they think that. I think they think the mother had been killed almost from the get-go because that car was upside down in the water for 14 hours.
Good Lord.
What does that tell you when you hear voices like that crawling for help? It's like maybe the mother from the other side was able to do that.
You know, George, that's not as unusual as it may sound. In fact, in near-death experience research, there have been many cases where somebody who is on the threshold of dying starts saying that he or she is seeing deceased relatives, in other words, spirits coming forward. And in many of the cases, people, loved ones, even hospital personnel actually see the spirits as well. And that's one of the things I get into in Evidence of Eternity is how when someone's transitioning to the other side, they're being welcomed into this other dimension. So in a case like with the little girl, it's very, very possible that her mother's spirit was still with her and lingering with her, and it was so intense, and the little girl fighting for her life was like in the near-death experience situations on that transitional zone, if you will. And, you know, this is not woo-hoo or as far out as it may seem. We're beginning to see this in clinical settings in studies conducted all over the world.
That love must be so strong, Mark, that it's able to pierce whatever is on the other side, to cut through into our own reality.
I couldn't agree more. You know, love, not even death can kill love. And that's something that I said in my first book, Never Letting Go, and certainly a concept that appears in Evidence of Eternity. And love is a form of energy, and energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transferred. It is truly wonderful that the police officers were able to experience that. And we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss these type of experiences if you're fortunate enough to have that happen to you.
Okay, so here you are, high-profile attorney in criminal cases, and you're a psychic. One of the most unusual mixes I've ever heard. You got this from what, your mother's side?
Both my mother and my father's side of the family. After I wrote Never Letting Go, I had so many people asking me about my family's psychic heritage, and one of my theories is that psychic ability tends to be genetic. In other words, there's a physiological reason why this happens. Everybody in the world has the same basic physiology. It's just that some people are better at certain things than others. Some people are better athletes, some people are better musicians, some are better mathematicians, so on and so forth. And it appears that in my family, this is what's known as a recessive trait. So in Evidence of Eternity, I wrote about the genetics behind spirit communication and the physiology. So in both sides of the family, this is what's known as a recessive trait. For the benefit of the listeners, a recessive trait would be like blue eyes in a family where most of the people have brown eyes, or people who are left-handed, because that's another inherited trait. But when both parents have a recessive trait, the likelihood of one or more of their children having that trait is increased, and that seems to be the case in my family.
Mark, when you started practicing this, do you remember the very first psychic awareness issue that you had?
I was about 4, and I started talking to friends. and you know, it's not unusual for children to have quote unquote invisible friends, but the difference is that I was communicating with spirits, and my parents, both being able to perceive spirits, saw that this was happening. And they were very good about it. They didn't chastise me or treat me like I was an oddball or you know, hurt me or anything like that, because I know a lot of mediums who have horror stories from their childhood.
Parents shut them down.
Yeah. And my dad especially, he said, Mark, you can't talk about this outside of the house. People won't understand. And the reason for that is the way his sister was treated. She was treated horribly, and I don't want to kind of give a spoiler alert because it's a pretty intense story that I recall in Evidence of Eternity.
Right.
So, growing up in a psychic environment was very interesting. I didn't think it was weird or unusual at the time because it was my reality. As I started getting older, George, I noticed that not everybody's mom and dad had the abilities that mine did, and it seemed like I could never get away with anything, which, when you're a teenager, is kind of problematic.
I know as a lawyer, you've taken an oath to defend whether somebody's guilty or innocent, and it's not the case. You're a lawyer, and that's your job. As a psychic, did you pick up feelings about some of your clients that maybe they were indeed guilty or not guilty?
Absolutely. And, as an attorney, I have an absolute obligation and oath to zealously represent someone accused of a crime despite my personal feelings. However, the longer I practiced law, I found that I could not handle representing child molesters or forcible rapists. I could just pick up on that energy, if you will, and it's not a very positive thing, because I felt that I was my ability to zealously represent them was being compromised. So I would refer them to law firms where people specialize in that type of thing. I would also pick up on the spirits of deceased loved ones around a lot of my clients. And I have a theory that I've developed and explained in detail in Evidence of Eternity about how grief leads to crime, which leads to grief. Because what I've seen in thousands of cases, I've never met a happy drug addict or alcoholic. People that turn to addictions are generally engaged in escapist behavior or in trying to suppress something which is extremely painful. And in the developmental stages of a person, either in their childhood or teen years or very early adults, what I have found, George, is that many times there's the loss of a significant person, a mother or father, a sibling, maybe even a pet, and that's never dealt with properly. And because not everyone comes from ideal homes where your parents sit down and talk to you and help you with grief counseling. A lot of them are like, dude, don't think about it, and they don't address the child, or they just sort of think the child's not going to really care or remember, and that's certainly not the case. So what happens is that grief is not properly dealt with, and it emerges in other ways through addictions, rage, anger, predatorial behaviors. So the grief then can very often lead to that person committing crimes, which then inflict grief upon another person. Case in point, people that are alcoholics that commit DUI manslaughters and people who engage in very impulsive and rage-oriented behaviors. And I have seen this hundreds, if not thousands of times, and that's one of the areas where my abilities as a psychic medium and my work as an attorney have worked in very perfect harmony, because you begin to see these patterns.
You have dealt with something that you call grief, crime, grief. What is that?
Well, the grief, crime, grief is when the grief isn't addressed properly. Now, let's say that a teenage boy loses someone very close to them, maybe a parent or a grandparent that took care of them.
Or sibling.
And the parents don't help the child by sending him or her to grief counseling or working with them, and they're told to forget about it, don't worry about it, or in many cases, here, drink this, smoke this. You can't take enough drugs to make your grief go away. You can't have enough sex to numb the pain of it. You can't ignore it. Grief is something that people have to embrace, they have to endure, and they have to go through the process. Because if you try to suppress it, it is going to emerge in other ways, which are going to be in behaviors that then can lead someone into committing crimes. And I'm not suggesting that everybody who has lost a loved one when they are young is going to turn into a criminal. However, the odds are greatly increased if the grief and the bereavement is not dealt with through healthful and healthy means, I highly recommend counseling. And George, particularly with children, you have to find out when a loved one dies, you have to talk to the child. And it's hard enough for, let's say, a parent loses a child, and then there's the surviving sibling of that child.
Oh, it's tough.
Yeah, it's important to find out, what does the child know about death? What is he or she feeling? Let the child express himself. The parents need to express themselves too. And this is where you turn to your faith community. Many churches, synagogues, mosques, spiritual gatherings have grief support.
Oh, they all help. Mark, let's come back. We'll talk more about this and also get into your book, Evidence of Eternity, next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast to Coast. We'll take your calls with Mark Anthony next hour. I notice the phones are ringing now. Just hold on. We'll get to you. Mark, Evidence of Eternity, of course. Tell me about the title.
What I've done in my work as a psychic medium is come into contact with thousands of people that I've conducted readings for, where I communicate with spirits of deceased loved ones and friends. And I decided that it was important to write a book that removes the fear and superstition from spirit communication. And so what I've done is I've basically taken the terminology that was coined in the Victorian era and kind of wiped the whole slate clean. I mean, even the term mediumship is a Victorian term. They refer to the person receiving the reading as the sitter, and there's all these very arcane concepts. Well, if you think about when spiritualism came into being in the mid 1800s up through the 1930s, that was kind of the heyday of it. These antiquated terms were fine for the time. Our understanding of frequency, of string theory, of quantum physics, and just of radio transmissions was very, very limited. Now it's so much more. So what I've done is, based on my own research on scientific facts, quantum physics, theoretical concepts, human physiology, and evidence, I have addressed several concerns and questions to establish that spirit communication is a reality, that faith and science are not mutually exclusive, and that there is a reason to explain people being able to communicate with spirits. I mean, George, for everything there's a quote-unquote delivery system. Things just don't happen for no reason. There is a logical explanation behind everything. It's just that we may not always have the technology fully developed to quantify it
and understand it.
And understand it, exactly. I mean, George, what we're doing right now is nothing short of miraculous technology. You're in California. I'm on the East Coast. We're talking in real time on the radio, which is getting bounced off satellites and broadcast worldwide. In 1850, that would be considered science fiction. In 1750, that would be considered witchcraft. So,
they'd be burning both of us. I don't know which one first.
Probably me. But what's happened is in the last century, our knowledge of frequency and communication has just grown by leaps and bounds. And people are very quick to dismiss spirit communication as being this woohoo, airy-fairy, new agey type thing. And they're not realizing that within our own brain, we have a very sophisticated communication device, the pineal gland. And that's one of the things that I go into in great detail in Evidence of Eternity, is explaining the physiology behind spirit communication.
Now, let's get into, of course, what you think this might be. Because, as we both agree now, it's not random. It's real. It's part of whatever this whole package is in this universe, or beyond the universe. Well, what do you think it is?
You mean spirit communication?
The other side.
The other side. According to the string theorists And string theory is, we just don't have a universe. We have several universes. In other words, multiverse.
And we may not have had a Big Bang, which
I know,
is
isn't
amazing.
that interesting?
Yeah.
So there's alternate theories on the beginning of the universe or the multiverses. The other side is another dimension, and you can call it the spirit realm, the other side, heaven, nirvana, whatever you would like to call it. But it appears to run parallel or exist parallel to ours. It's a lot like AM and FM radio. They're both frequencies and amplitudes, and they run parallel to each other. Occasionally, maybe they overlap. So you have to look at it in terms of that. And, a lot of the debunkers and the naysayers, oh, that's impossible, it's impossible. But, when you look at the visible spectrum, what we can see with our eyes is such a small percentage of what is actually out there in the electromagnetic spectrum. There's gamma rays, X-rays, microwaves. There's all sorts of frequencies and waves and energy bands that we are physically incapable of perceiving. In fact, the dark matter theorists have stated that over 90% of our universe would be invisible to the naked eye and essentially to our technology. So if we're only at best capable of perceiving 10% of the universe, then it is ridiculous to say that, just because I don't understand it, it's outside of my realm of experience, or I can't see it, or that we don't have a test that we can currently subject it to, that the other side does not exist. When for thousands of years, from the beginning of the dawn of recorded history, people have reported spiritual encounters from ancient India, China, Egypt, Peru, all over the world up until today. So the other side is a parallel dimension, and energy being neither created nor destroyed, only transferred. When a person dies, the energy that is enshrined within them leaves the body. Now, the big question is, what does it take with it? And I certainly believe, as do the near-death experience researchers and survival of conscious study scientists, that your personality, who and what we are, is what goes with the energy when it leaves our body.
And what is amazing about all of this, Mark, is there's no way it was just jumbled together and happened. Somehow, whatever we want to call it God, call it divine intervention, call it some kind of intelligence in the cosmos, something was creative enough to make this all gel. Don't you think?
I agree with that. And, that gets into the question of what is God. And I had a lengthy discussion with Dr. Eben Alexander, who wrote Proof of Heaven. He and I were both speakers at the Edgar Cayce Association for Research and Enlightenment at their Afterlife conference last fall. And I've talked to a number of people who've had near-death experiences, including my own father, who's had two of them. And what happens is when a person's consciousness separates from their body, they go through a tunnel, or what they perceive to be a tunnel, into this light. They're greeted by the spirits of people they know who have passed. And then beyond that, everyone talks about the white light. And
they all do.
Intelligence. They all do. And the thing is, these studies have been conducted all over the world, in the U.S., Canada, the U.K., France, Holland, Italy, Russia, Australia, Japan, South Africa, India, and they're all saying the same things. And when they get to that white light, everyone describes it in terms of God. In fact, as Dr. Alexander explained to me, he said even the word God is too limiting. It's so far beyond that. And that's one of the things that I discuss in Evidence of Eternity is we are in the material world. We're having a finite material world existence, yet we are trying to understand something which is infinite, which our brain is not capable of doing. However, our spirit which exists independently, our consciousness is more than the sum total of the brain, is able to, once it is released from the material world confines of a finite body.
What do you say, Mark, to those skeptics, and there are many, who do not believe in an afterlife, who simply say, this is bunk, it does not happen. When you die, that's it. It goes dark, curtains fall, that's it. What do you say to them?
That they're in for a really big surprise. In fact, in near-death experience studies, a number of people who were atheists had a near-death experience, and I believe Nancy Evans Bush, who was with the Association for Near-Death Experience Studies, said that people who are atheists who have a near-death experience don't believe that there's a God. They know there's a God when they come back. So it's not unusual for people when they cross into the light and they experience this, that it completely radically changes their worldview. And as far as, the people that are the debunkers and the skeptics, they have an absolute right to believe in nothing. And, when you're depressed and you're sad and you're crushed under the weight of grief and everything in your universe is bleak, then look to nothing, okay? And for those who believe in nothing, that's like saying in the beginning there was nothing, and then nothing happened to nothing, and then nothing suddenly exploded, creating everything, and then parts of everything started rearranging itself into organic, self-replicating particles that somehow or other became dinosaurs.
Well, what I tell skeptics, Mark, I say, look, if I'm right about the existence of the other side, we, both of us, will know that eventually. But if you're right, to the skeptic, I say, we won't know anyway.
Yeah, that's a very existentialist philosophy, that everything that we do is futile because we're going to die, but we pretend that it's not. And that existential thinking has permeated itself into the debunkers and the skeptics. And you have to look at where existentialism came from. This was by Jean-Paul Sartre and other people that were horribly abused and subjected to Nazi war crimes during the Second World War. So when you're coming from an extremely pessimistic and negative place, you get out of something what you put into it. You put negativity in, you get negativity out. I like to look more toward the teachings of Jesus and the Buddha and Krishna and Gandhi and the enlightened avatars who have graced us with their presence on earth to tell us that there is an afterlife. And then for people all over the world, and you don't have to be a medium to have a mediumistic experience. Everyone is capable of a mediumistic experience, although not everyone may be a medium. And it is truly a gift from God to let us know that life is truly everlasting.
And is it okay that science and faith cross?
I think so. And one of my theories in Evidence of Eternity is that faith and science are not mutually exclusive. In fact, if you look at a lot of the laws of physics and then religious and spiritual philosophies, that in every major world religion, there's a belief that there is a soul or an energy which temporarily inhabits a body, and then when the body no longer functions, it moves on. In other words, the soul, the spirit, whatever you want to call it, pre-exists the body, comes into the body. When the body no longer functions, when we physically die, that moves on. The second law of thermodynamics. Energy is neither created nor destroyed, only transferred. So when you start looking at the concepts of energy and energy transfer and frequency and apply it to spirit communication, we're beginning to see parallels. Certainly survival of consciousness studies, which have been conducted all over the world, are showing this. So I do not believe that science and faith are mutually exclusive. Now, I know that recently somebody has suggested that the Big Bang Theory did not happen. But last year, Pope Francis said something which was really quite amazing, and he's an incredible guy, and I'm a huge fan. He said that the Big Bang does not contradict the creative intervention of God. Rather, it depends upon it.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Whatever happened, you've got to use this divine power and include that. I have said for years, Mark, that I never really understood the Big Bang. I could not comprehend how something came from nothing and exploded, if that's indeed what happened, and we have all this throughout the universe. I just don't get it. And I really haven't had a great physicist who's been able to explain that to us. As good as Michio Kaku is and folks like that we've had on the program, nobody really can explain the Big Bang. So when these two physicists came out a few weeks ago and said, there's a possibility there was never a Big Bang, that the universe always was, I remember what my mother used to tell me about God. She used to say, he always was and always will be. It sounds like the universe.
It certainly does. It certainly does. And there we have it again. We have some theoretical physicists who are saying that the universe has always existed and always will. And we've had religions telling us God has always existed and always will. So we're now living in an age where spirituality and science are not opposed, but they seem to be coinciding in many ways. I think that the ultimate objective of science is the discovery of God. Now, will that happen in our lifetime or in this century? Will it take centuries? I don't think it really matters. But I believe that we have an intellect and an intelligence and an insatiable curiosity for a reason. I mean, if God didn't want us to question the infinity and the nature of the universe and spirit communication, then we'd be like a school of fish. We'd all be the same color, the same size. We'd react to light and stimuli the same way, and that would be that. But we're not. We're all individuals and unique, and that's one of the concepts that I explain in Evidence of Eternity.
I love asking authors the favorite part of their book. So I've got to say that with you with Evidence of Eternity. What was the favorite part of that book, Mark?
Oh, my gosh. That's a hard one to ask.
I know it. It's a tough question.
It is a tough question. I think it's probably where I explain mediumship in a new way. I refer to it as interdimensional communication, because what we're doing is we're not just talking to spirits. We are receiving messages and we're receiving energies from a parallel dimension. And what I did in that chapter is some years ago I was part of a photographic expedition that went up the Amazon River, and we were in the middle of nowhere. You're always somewhere, but we were in the deepest, darkest regions of the Amazon. There was no electricity, running water, and the research vessel that I was on, La Esmeralda, it held about a dozen passengers and as many crew, and it was kind of like a big clankety clank. It was funny because some of the people were saying it's like a big version of the African Queen clanking up the Amazon. And we came upon a village, and all these canoes came up to us, and the villagers kept telling us about El Brujo, and they told us that the witch doctor was in the village and would be performing an exorcism, and we were invited to see. Now, I don't want to give any spoiler alerts, but what I did is I compared people who base their belief systems on ignorance, fear, and superstition. And I don't mean any insult to the natives of the region, but there were things that they simply didn't understand, so ergo it was evil and attributable to demons. And that's why a lot of people look at what I do as a psychic medium as, oh, it's against God and it's evil and it's this and that, because they're embracing fear as opposed to using our God-given brain.
Well, like you say, in the 1700s, you would have been burned at the stake. Mark, stay with us. We're coming back. We'll flip the switch, and we'll take phone calls with you next. Welcome back. Mark Anthony with us. We're going to be talking about his work, Evidence of Eternity, with you. We'll take your calls when we come back on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back. Mark Anthony with us, Evidence of Eternity. Mark's an attorney, of course, but he's also a psychic. I'm going to ask you, which do you enjoy?
Oh, it's much more fun being a psychic.
It is. It is. A little more, how should I say, people, you probably have clients that think the world of you, too, when you win for them.
Yeah, they do. They do. But what's happened is that the demands for my services as a psychic medium have increased so much that temporarily put my law practice on hold because I'm about to embark on a nationwide book tour.
Are you coming out to L.A. at all?
I am. It looks like I'm going to be out in L.A. hopefully in the next couple weeks. We're working on things.
All right, I'll be out here. What about St. Louis? Are they in the mix?
St. Louis. It'll be back in St. Louis. It looks like Pittsburgh, Denver, right. Atlanta. My Facebook page will be announcing all of that. And if people want to go to my website, evidenceofeternity.com, you can follow. There's an icon there to follow me on Facebook, and also my calendar of events will have that as well. So I'm really looking forward to doing that. And one of the reasons I wrote Evidence of Eternity was when I was on the book tour for Never Letting Go. So many people were asking me questions about, do animals have souls? Is reincarnation real? What's the other side like? What happens when I die? Is there a God? So what I started doing is compiling these questions and then doing my research both through external means and through spirit contact. And that was the genesis, if you will, for Evidence of Eternity, because trying to portray this to people in a logical and common sense fashion, where I combine faith and science.
Well, if we can meet up in L.A., I'd love to come to your book signing. So let's see if that's doable.
It'd be my honor. It'd be my honor. And congratulations on the Gaiam TV. I hope I'm pronouncing it right.
Yes, well, it's beyond belief. And
beyond belief.
That's the TV show.
I think that's wonderful what you're doing. So, yes, we will certainly be in touch.
All right, let's take some calls here. We've got an hour to go, and it will go by quickly. Linda's in Windsor, Canada, my old stomping grounds. Hi, Linda.
You betcha. And lucky you, Mark, you're going to meet George, which is nice.
I've actually had the privilege of meeting George. We were on a panel of experts at the Pensacola Paracon, actually.
That was about 2 or 3 years ago, wasn't it?
It was. It was just when Never Letting Go had come out.
That's right.
And
Raymond Moody was with us, I think, wasn't he? Yeah.
Yes, Raymond Moody, Dave Schrader, who is
our buddy,
one of the hosts here on Coast to Coast a lot, and it was really great.
It's a great bunch of people to be around. Believe me, the energy is fantastic. But I want to thank you, Mark. What you're saying is so true, and you are correct. And why I am saying this, because I've experienced, not all, but some, which is so true. There is life after death. My own sister got in touch with me, and believe me, I understood it, and the way it happened was, not, it was a spiritual happening, but you just know. People do look at you kind of strange, and they think you're way off the bounds there. But thank you for telling people, because today we're too much on the material. We're addressing our material, we're throwing things at our material, and we're forgetting our spiritual, inside of us. And
that's a good point. And Linda, it's first off, it's a privilege to talk to you because you have had an experience and you recognize it. See, spirits are around us all the time, And the first chapter of my new book is Spiritual Situational Awareness, and how we need to be open and aware of that. And it sounds to me like you have a highly developed sense of spiritual situational awareness.
I am thankful for that, and I remain humble. Now, here's my big question, and I've mentioned this to ministers. Why do they not teach like you teach? Because what you speak of is in the Bible, and it is proof. And reincarnation, I found scriptures, they're there. Why do they not teach the people on the spiritual side just like you're doing?
That's a great question. It depends who you talk to. When you get to some of the extreme and more conservative elements in religions, they tend to shy away from that. Yet I've had discussions with Protestant ministers and Catholic priests about reincarnation and spirituality. So it's there. It's just who you talk to. And some religions are premised on reincarnation and understanding the afterlife. In the West, we tend to question whether or not God exists, whereas in the East, particularly in Hinduism, seeing God is part of your spiritual journey, and phenomenon that we would call psychic activity is considered to be part of one's spiritual journey. And so I think it's nice when some of the other cultures and religions are beginning to interface with us. I think an interfaith approach is very positive. And I like, and George, I want to thank you for playing George Harrison on the break.
Sure.
Because George Harrison said something once that a quote that really has resonated with me, that all religions are branches of one big tree, and it doesn't matter what you call God, just so long as you call.
That's a good point. Let's take Randy, truck driving in Wyoming, first-time caller. Randy, thanks for calling. Go ahead.
Yes. Hello, George.
Hi, Randy.
I love your show, man. I listen to it every night. I was just down in Los Angeles, too, and wished I could have been able to stop over and see you.
Would have been great.
But anyway, when back in 1986, in 78, me and my wife got in a car accident, and she was 8 months pregnant, and she ended up losing the baby that night, and it was in this hospital in Evanston, Wyoming. Well, right after that, they shut it down, made it into a treatment center, and I ended up in that treatment center, and they made the emergency room into a bedroom. And I ended up being in that bedroom. Well, that one night while I was there, I smelled this smell that smelled like burnt toast. And I felt like I was going through this tunnel. And when I emerged out of that tunnel, I had to go find where that toast was coming from. And I went down, my spirit went down to the kitchen, realized there was absolutely nothing going on there. And then I went back, went back through the tunnel, smelt that toast smell. And I believe the smell was your spirit going to your body. And I believe that my feeling is that when you see that tunnel, it's your spirit going to your body, getting out.
Well, that's a good point, and it can be, Mark.
I think that that's a really great way of explaining it, Randy, because it makes a lot of sense. I've had spirits explain to me, what it's like to separate from the body, and the way that it's been conveyed to me, because I feel sensations. Randy, have you ever taken one of those little 9-volt batteries, little square ones, and stuck them on your tongue?
Oh, you can feel the tingle.
You feel the tingle, and that's how spirits communicated to me that's kind of what it feels like. In other words, there's like this tingly, sparky sensation, and then you separate from the body. And when I started thinking about it, wow, once again, we're back to energy, electricity. I mean, our body, our brain, our heart, our neural network has an energy field. In fact, in a recent edition of the Scientific American, a scientist, a medical doctor / scientist, was explaining that let's say you get an injury on your toe and immediately you feel it. This is moving so quick. It's faster than chemicals can transmit that sensation. It's faster than nerve can transmit it. And the theory now is that each cell has photons in it which are emitting light, and so that this is happening at light speed. And the really fascinating thing, and I'm glad that you brought that up, Randy, about the light, is that every great spiritual teacher from ancient India through Jesus, through Buddha, through Gandhi, through Mother Teresa, all the way up to Yogananda Paramahansa, have all referred to God in terms of light. And so what we're now seeing is that when people go into the light, what you're perceiving, we think, we believe, I believe, is the spiritual energy of God. And then Jesus even said that the kingdom of God is within. So if we're all cells in the body of God, then from a cellular level, we're emitting light from something as small as a cell all the way up to God. And light is the connection.
And I've got to say, Mark, that people who understand this, I think, are so much more advanced than other people, because not a lot of folks get this. Have you found that out to be the truth?
We're all on our own spiritual journeys, and some people are on different parts of the path. And, it's really easy for some people to say, oh, you're terrible, and I don't believe you, and you're wrong, and all that. And, this isn't about sitting and judging other people's spiritual journeys. We should focus on our own. And so when people condemn those of us who study this and do our best to understand this, that's because they're in a different part of their journey, and it is not my place to sit in judgment of anyone.
Well, good for you. We go to Angel in Seattle, Washington, west of the Rockies. Angel, you're on the air with us. Go ahead.
Oh, good evening, George. Excellent
Hey.
show. Good evening, Mr. Anthony. How are you?
I'm doing fine, Angel. You can call me Mark.
Mark, I feel very honored. I'm a little nervous because there's millions of people listening, but I have a question concerning people that have crossed over. Can they help you from the other side when you have unresolved issues? I actually had a premonition of my mother passing away and didn't know about it. And then the next day she went into a coma and had a cerebral hemorrhage. And I started my spiritual journey. Your book, Never Letting Go, has helped me tremendously. A friend gave it to me because I started suffering from insomnia, and I was really in bad shape. And she comes to me in dreams often. She's given me numbers, and I've called numbers, and it's concerning a legal issue that I have. And I'm just wondering, can they be your guide? Is she trying to help me with, I suffered quite severely in the past 5 years, and so I'm wondering if she's kind of like my angel right now. And George's show has helped me tremendously with, getting information and helping me on my spiritual path. It's just a great show, and I hope people that are listening to know that I thought that I was alone, but you really are never alone. I mean, I feel her. I've had amazing experiences where people have said things like strangers, and I think she'll come and they'll speak through her. So I'm wondering what's your take on that?
You're absolutely correct, Angel. Spirits are around us constantly, and as you understand, I explained that in Never Letting Go and how they reach out from the other side to help us. And in Evidence of Eternity, I take it even farther. In the chapter entitled Frequency Beacons, I explain the energetic link between people living in the material world and spirits on the other side, and how they are aware of what's going on with us. To answer your question, is she acting as a guide? Very possibly. I don't believe that spirits will necessarily intervene to change the course of our life, although that can happen. It is for us to make our own decisions in the world but they may help guide us to make the decision which is in our best interest. And a lot of times what is in our best interest isn't what we always want. So
right.
it is good. Yeah, so I think that our own individual uniqueness is yet another gift from God, and it is incumbent upon us to learn to make our own decisions. However, it never hurts to get spiritual guidance.
Excellent. Right. And where can we get is that a new book? I'm sorry, I didn't
Brand
hear
new.
The title.
Yeah, Evidence of Eternity was just released yesterday, and forgive me for the shameless self-promotion, but it's already hit number 1 in paperback and number 2 on Amazon's reincarnation bestseller list. I understand it's selling out in bookstores nationwide.
Isn't that exciting?
Available. It's just overwhelming and so humbling. I'm just, all I can say to everybody is thank you so much.
Let's go to Josie now. Josie in Richmond, Virginia. Hi, Josie.
Hello, greetings to both of you.
You too, Josie.
My question is about the missing people in the parks that Mr. Pilates has reported on that are so weird and odd that it's not a person that did it or a criminal. And then there's this missing airplane that everybody's been trying to find and what was going on that would cause it to crash in the first place. And there was an Egyptian airliner some years back, maybe 15 years ago, that off of, I think, Newfoundland crashed. What was going on in that plane that had a lot of Egyptian military men, I think, that were on that plane.
Yeah, we think the pilot tanked that one, but you're right. Strange things.
You mean on purpose?
Yeah.
But it was before all the jihad stuff was going on.
Yes, it was just.
But do you think was he doing just jihad or what?
No, he was a troubled pilot, and he just decided to take a little plunge and
take all these people with him. Isn't that a shame?
Yep.
So what was about the other ones where the people are in parks and they're different ages from really small and they're found way high on a mountain and could never have gotten there by human means?
I don't know if you're into that, Mark, but let me tell you, it's a strange phenomenon. People disappearing in parks, just gone.
I've heard about that. I haven't done intensive research on that, and I know that there's all sorts of theories that there's a vortex, or maybe they're crossing into a different dimension, or
ETs, who knows
somehow. Yeah, it's here's the thing. It's Josie, right?
Josie, yeah.
Josie, we have to keep an open mind. You have to keep an open mind, because the one thing I have learned is that there's so much more to life and to the world than what we're capable of physically perceiving.
There's no doubt about that. One of our favorite slogans. Mark, we're going to come back in a moment here with you on Coast to Coast and take final phone calls. Mark Anthony with us. Evidence of Eternity. Like he said, that the book is already zoomed up to number 1 on Amazon.com, and it's selling out of bookstores just like hotcakes. Do hotcakes sell? I don't know. They've always used that phrase. By the way, back to us. If you need to email me, George at coasttocoastam.com. And please make sure you like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. You can do that by going to coasttocoastam.com. Far right-hand corner, look for the icons and just do what you have to do. Indeed it is. And Mark was mentioning our television program on Beyond Belief. Some incredible fun times there. You can watch the program for a while for free, so take advantage of it. Go to this website, beyondbelief.com. Write it down, easy to remember, www.beyondbelief.com. And we'll be back in a moment with your final calls on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast to Coast. Mark Anthony with us, your final calls as well. Mark, as far as you're concerned with the other side, a lot of people are pet owners, and they're concerned about whether their animals can go to the other side or they have souls. What do you think?
Absolutely, I believe that. And I've conducted thousands of readings, and in so many of them, animals come through. And my theory and my belief is that any being capable of the emotion of love is capable of spirit communication, because spirit communication is a love-based function. I mean, I've had cats, dogs, horses, birds, bunnies come through. It's just been amazing. And in Evidence of Eternity, I explained what I refer to as interspecies, interdimensional communication. And it's fascinating communicating with animals because it's different than communicating with the spirits of humans. It's a different form of intelligence. I don't buy the saying dumb animals. Animals are not dumb. They simply manifest intelligence differently than we do. And we meaning people who study animals and animal communication, are seeing all types of behaviors that appear to be much more complex than we ever thought. I mean, animals bond with us. It's more than just we're a food source. They bond with us emotionally, vibrationally, and so I wrote a chapter on interspecies, interdimensional communication, and I'd love to tell stories from it, but I want people to enjoy reading them because I spent a lot of time.
Oh, you're such a tease.
Putting things together.
Let's go next to William in Bloomington, Illinois, on the wild card line. William, thanks for calling. Go ahead.
Good morning, Mark, and good morning, George.
Hello there.
I will.
I often wondered that if you have the spirits when we die, how and why can't those spirits battle the evil spirits on this planet to put them in check, or either try to destroy them, or whatever the case may be? But the second thing is, too, that I believe the universe is so complex and so vast and so intricate, I don't think it was put together by chance.
No, you got that right.
Yeah.
But what about the spirits, the good and the bad, Mark?
Well, I kind of think your second question answers your first, because the universe is so complex. And when I was in England working with British mediums, we were talking about negative energies getting in, and I try to refer to them as negative energies or energies that are not necessarily aligned with human spirits. Maybe they're more plant aligned or earth aligned, because there's a lot of intelligent non-human spiritual entities on the other side. And I may be departing with a lot of my colleagues, but I don't necessarily buy the evil spirit philosophy. I think a lot of times when interfacing with these things, we don't understand them, and it evokes an electrical reaction in your body where you get cold chills and tingles, which we immediately assume as being negative, because that's the same flight or fight response. But for the sake of discussion, at any one time, you've got your main spirit guide and several other spirits around you that are working with you. In addition to, you can have friends and relatives that are on the other side. You may have some angelic entities there. So at any given moment, everybody has about 50 or 60 spirits around them. If Funky Freddy wants to get in, he's going to have to go through a couple football teams. So I'm not really too worried about things like that. What it comes down to is keep your intention, keep your spirituality positive. If you feel there may be a negative energy around you, envision, think of, let's give a tribute to Leonard Nimoy. Think of a Star Trek when the transporter comes down, there's a beam of light around you. Actually envision the beam of light. You can refer to that as the white light of God, the Holy Spirit, positive energy. And let me tell you something, you have nothing to worry about then, because the darkest of darkness cannot even stand up to but one flicker from a candle.
We've got Michael now, Long Island, New York. Hey, Michael, thank you for calling. You're on the air.
Good evening, George. Hey, how are you?
Good, sir. Thank you.
I just love your show. And to the guest, Mark, I've experienced sometimes, I would say I'm a sometimes medium and can't explain my moods or my feelings, but I'm not in touch with the identity of that spirit.
Right.
And I want to know how, can you control the passage of spirits? And can you actually? I actually can. Sometimes I smell. There's a woman and there's a perfume that she wears.
Right.
And it's unexplainable. But can you control it? Are you that powerful of a psychic?
You know,
can you control
I wouldn't
the passage?
necessarily say, powerful so much as, let's say that Michael Phelps, when he was 10 years old, probably could swim pretty well. All right? And he needed swimming lessons to enhance his ability. Same thing. I'm sure Stephen Hawking was really good at doing math when he was 10, but he needed training. And you apparently have ability, and feeling the presence, you have to work with it, prayer, meditation, certainly, but there's exercises and things that you can do in spiritual development classes which can help you to refine that ability.
If you think, Mark, that the other side is laden with goodness, there is evil, and you agree with that.
Of course. I mean, just look at the world we live in. I mean,
it sometimes seems that evil is winning. How can that be?
Well, I don't, and I may be departing with a lot of my colleagues, but I don't believe in hell. I do believe in reincarnation, and I believe that hell is here on earth. When you do something negative or evil to another person, it's not because you're acting out of love for that person. You're acting out of a me as center of the universe, me. And evil, when you look at an organization like ISIL, and I don't want to get all political, but I mean, can you think of anything more evil? And they're doing it in the name of God, which is the greatest evil of all. So, it can appear that evil is winning. On the other hand, what makes the news? What's that old story? A dog bites man, no big deal. Man bites dog, that's news.
Lead story.
Lead story. When something, quote-unquote, evil happens, that gets more coverage than, beautiful crop of corn this summer.
That's right. See, the lead would be corn formations, right? Crop formations in the cornfields. That's a big story.
Right. Crop formations, mutilated bodies found, film at 11.
Yep, exactly. Steve in Huntsville, Alabama. Stephen, you're up with us. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you, George, for taking my call.
You're very welcome.
And I can't wait to get your book, Mark.
Thank you, Stephen.
I have two questions. I recently read a book called Directive Destiny by J. Michael Franklin. And if I understand the premise of the book, it's that before we were people, we were angels. And after we die, we go back to being angels. And I don't know if that means all of us or just some of us, but do you think this could be true? And if so, why become human? I mean, human is not, it would be worse than being angels. And if it's not true, then since our souls are eternal or immortal, then where do you think they were before we were born?
Okay, with all due respect to that author, I respectfully disagree. Angels exist, but they're a separate species. Angels were never people. People were never angels. So human spirits are a completely different frequency, if you will. And from what I've seen is human and angelic entities seem to work quite harmoniously on the other side. So when we die, we don't turn into an angel. And I know that I'm not alone in that belief, but there are some people that would tend to disagree with me because, we're dealing with infinity and we're trying to understand infinity through a finite set of eyes. Now, your question before is, if souls always existed and will exist, where will they go? Once again, and that's a great question, we're trying to understand infinity through a finite set of equipment. So we may know that the universe is expanding and is into infinity, but we can't really grasp that. And I explained this in very great detail in Evidence of Eternity, and it would require a lot more time than we've got in this segment for me to do that. But I think those are excellent questions. And the thing is, the path to all knowledge begins with this statement: I don't know.
And that is honest. Rick in Brentwood, California, you're up with us on the air. Rick, go ahead. You there, Rick?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
There you go. Sure thing.
Yeah, I'd like to share with the Coast to Coast viewers an amazing experience that I had.
Sure.
Remember, have you ever heard of Dr. Newman? He's a healer.
You're breaking up a little bit. I didn't hear that.
Have you ever heard of Dr. Newman?
Dr. Newman. I have not.
Okay, well,
no, that's not going to work. Rick, try to get a better line. Sorry. Gosh, I would have loved to hear that story.
I know. I was hearing as he was coming in and out, so hopefully Rick will get you back.
Tony in Detroit, you're up with us. Hi, Tony. Go ahead.
Hi. Good morning.
Morning.
I had two experiences with synchronicity. One was with my grandmother via my mother, who also has passed. She had an experience where she was watching a PBS program, and he was describing butterflies visiting a loved one to impart.
Like somebody would die and a butterfly would show up?
The butterfly landed on her hand, and it was with Wayne Dwyer was on PBS, and he was saying that was a suggestion that her spirit was okay, and the butterfly landed on her hand.
Yeah, he has said that on our show before, Tony. And Mark, have you ever heard of symbols like that from the dead?
Yes. I don't believe that a person turns into a butterfly to come to you. However, what I do believe is that spirits are capable of directing the attention of some life forms, like butterflies or even birds, and somebody will notice those all the time. People that tell me after a loved one died, they always seem to find, a particular coin, maybe a dime or a nickel or something like that. They always find that. And I don't necessarily think that the spirit is causing that dime to materialize there so much as they are directing our attention to that. So that really is a very good question. It's all about directing energy.
Sometimes, though, the departed one, let's say, had a coin collection or, whatever, and you would see that, and it would be like a tie-in, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, because they know that that's going to resonate with you and make that association. I was doing a reading for a client, and her son had come through, and I said, I keep seeing pure silver dollars. Does that make sense? She goes, no, not at all. I go, are you sure? She says, well, not with my son, but with my father-in-law. He collected pure silver dollars, and he died 3 weeks ago. So what was going on is, even though we were communicating with her son, the spirit of her father-in-law, who was her son's grandfather, was attempting to come into the reading. So it is not unusual for a spirit to direct someone's attention, direct their energy to something which will resonate with that person and make them think of that person. That's what I call a frequency beacon. I think I mentioned that earlier in the show, and that's one of the theories that I've developed in Evidence of Eternity.
Allie is truck driving in Alabama. Hello, Allie. Go ahead.
Hi there. I am so happy that I got through. It
Great.
is meant for me to talk to you guys. Mark Anthony, George, hi. This is my first time ever calling.
Well, super.
I have answers for you.
Okay.
What caught my attention? I'm a truck driver. What caught my attention was, what is that white light when you make your transition over? And this book, I don't know if you've ever heard of this book. It's called RAMTHA, R-A-M-T-H-A.
Yep, sure do.
Okay. In that book, it tells you that when you do make your transition over, it is your white light that shines through, because we are all light beings. You're pure positive energy. In the book, It also says, it explains what God is, how God was created, what happens to us when we make our transition over. It talks about the 7 planes. Jesus talked about the 7 mansions in the Bible. It tells you that when you pass over, whatever your attitudes are about your life experiences, where it depends on what level of spiritual development you have grown to, depends on what plane you go to. The 7.
Oh, you are going to love my book, Evidence of Eternity. If you like that, you're going to absolutely love Evidence of Eternity. Right on point, yes. Yes, we are light beings. Even Albert Einstein said we are all light beings because light's energy. And that's what I was talking about earlier, that on a cellular level, it is believed now that we have photons in our cells. In other words, light exists in a cellular level on us, and all the way, the great connection in the universe, all the way to God is the light. And I like to say that we're all cells in the body of God. So I think that you will definitely find a lot of resonance as an Evidence of Eternity.
Let's take 1 or 2 more calls. We have Brian in Warrensburg, Missouri. Hello, Brian. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for taking my call, George.
Sure thing.
Hey, Mark, I want to know your take on a lot of religion talks about heaven and hell and how, our decisions in this life have influence on where we go or what happens in the afterlife. I want to know what your take is on that.
Absolutely. All right, science and faith. The law of karma, everything you do comes back to you. That's what the Buddhists and the Hindus believe. Christians believe and it's in the book of Galatians, whatever a man shall sow, he shall reap. Physics teaches us for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. Everything we do has repercussions. As an attorney, I have seen so many guilty people slide through the system. And you think, how can someone has done these despicable things get away with it? Well, the truth of the matter is they don't. The other side has many levels. In fact, one of the chapters in Evidence of Eternity is the levels of the other side. And then there's another chapter entitled Reincarnation, the Justice and Balance of God. So the fact is, you need to listen to not you, but I mean everybody needs to listen to what Jesus said. Treat other people the way you want to be treated. And Buddha said, do not do to other people what you don't want them to do to you. So, we're seeing in all the major religions, there is a golden rule. Keep your actions positive because there is going to be an equal and opposite reaction.
Mark Anthony with us, his book, Evidence of Eternity, and you can go to his website, which is linked up for you at coasttocoastam.com because of his little book tour that he's going to undertake. So make sure if you're in a city where he's going to show up, you pop up and say hi to him. Up next, we go searching for Atlantis. And welcome back to Coast to Coast. A few years ago, Mark Adams made a very strange discovery. Everything you know about the legendary lost city of Atlantis comes from the work of one man, he believes, the Greek philosopher, Plato. In a moment, we talk with Mark Adams. Meet me in Atlantis on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie with you. Mark Adams has been fascinated with lost cities and sacred ruins since he was just a little boy at 12 when he saw Raiders of the Lost Ark. Mark has explored and gathered information as part of his life's work. He's written for publications ranging from National Geographic, Adventure to GQ to Rolling Stone. He's been researching the lost city of Atlantis with this book, Meet Me in Atlantis. He was with me a couple years ago when we talked about Turn Right at Machu Picchu. Welcome back, Mark. Exciting. You know what? You are the modern-day Indiana Jones.
It's very kind of you to say.
Good, man. You know what? We almost lost Indiana Jones with that little plane crash.
I know.
That was a scary story. But you know what? His abilities saved his life, I think.
That's what I'm told. I was reading some, pilot blogs, and they said that the real story the kind of craft he was piloting, which is a World War II aircraft, and B, the fact that he did get it down on the ground. It wasn't, some sort of stall or something. He actually was able to get the thing down, which not everybody could.
Why are we so fascinated, Mark, with Atlantis?
Well, Atlantis is a utopia, and everybody sees Atlantis, and when it's almost like a funhouse mirror, and you sort of project onto Atlantis whatever it is that you want to see there, whether it's a perfect past society or whether it's a warlike race, as Plato says in the original story. And it's just a great mystery story, this sophisticated civilization that disappears, as Plato says, in a grievous day and a night. It's just a great story.
How advanced do you think they were?
It's hard to say. He doesn't give a lot of detail in the original. I mean, I should say a lot of what we hear about Atlantis that we get in pop culture, these are things that are picked up through Ignatius Donnelly. Ignatius Donnelly was a Minnesota former congressman in the 1880s, who wrote the first great book of Atlantology, or The Search for Atlantis. And he sort of cherry-picked all these pieces of information from ancient history and came up with the idea that this was a super advanced race. There's not a lot of evidence for that. There's not a lot of evidence against it. But what Plato said was this was a maritime culture. They had sophisticated armaments, ships, chariots, that sort of thing. He did say it was 9600 BC, more or less, according to his numbers. If that were the case, it would be a very sophisticated culture for that time.
Mark, let's talk about what we believe Atlantis to be and where it might be, and then we'll get into your thoughts and your work on Plato. Generally, people believe that Atlantis was in the Atlantic, right?
Right.
What do we know? What do we think we know?
I think part of that is it goes back to, you're playing the great Donovan song at the beginning here. Donovan is a great influence on why we think Atlantis was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. We just hear it repeated over and over and over, and of course the names sound the same. But again, the Atlantic Ocean thing goes back to Ignatius Donnelly's, it's a fascinating book. It's called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, and it's still in print after 130 years. What he did was he looked at some new science. For the first time, scientists, oceanographers were looking at the ocean floor, and he said, look, this goes down, and if you look at the Azores Islands, which are now owned by Portugal, I think those are the mountaintops that Plato describes in Atlantis. Plato says there's a giant mountain which blocks the winds from the north. And this has just sort of lingered over time, and the idea that it sank to the bottom, because that would be the only way you could get these Azores Islands. But it would be very, very difficult for an island to sink that far. And Plato doesn't actually say that it sank. He said it was hit by earthquakes and floods. And that, to me, doesn't sound like a sinking.
Might it have been included in the flood of Noah, or was that, which do you think came first?
It's hard to say. Plato says that Atlantis was the third great flood before Deucalion. If you go back and look at the ancient flood myths, and almost every culture has an ancient flood myth, the Deucalion myth, which is from Greece, the Noah's flood story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a story of Manu. They all have very similar characteristics, which leads some to believe, and when I say some, this includes anthropologists and historians, to think that maybe there was one catastrophic event. And in fact, there's a fellow who makes a very compelling argument for the idea that that there was a comet that hit in the Indian Ocean around 2807 BC.
Okay, so let's go into some of your theories of Atlantis in your work. First of all, give us the kind of investigations that you undertook to try to get these answers. What did you do? How'd you start?
Well, the first thing I did was I went back to the original source. Everybody who talks about Atlantis, their original source is Plato, whether they know it or not. It's the first written source. It's the only actual written source, original source on Atlantis. So I went back to Plato, and the amazing thing about Plato is it's a treasure map. There are dozens and dozens of specific details in the original Atlantis story. He says it was located opposite the Pillars of Hercules. He said it was a 3-ringed concentric city. He says it was located near a land called Gades. He says how big the plain was, and that the plain was cross-hatched with huge canals. He says there was this mountain to the north that blocked the winds. There's all sorts of detail in there. So what I did was I looked at this detail, and then I started speaking to people who had spent a lot of time searching for Atlantis. And I eventually drew up a list of what seemed to me the 4 most likely locations for Atlantis.
Okay, let's narrow them down.
Okay. Number 1 would be southern Spain. About 10 years ago, a German physicist named Rainer Kuhne published a short article in the archaeological journal Antiquity. And this is a big deal because academics typically treat Atlantis like kryptonite. They don't want to go anywhere near it, not with a 10-foot pole. But Antiquity is one of the leading journals. And he said, if you look at satellite photos, you can see shapes in what is now Doñana National Park in southern Spain that correspond to Plato's descriptions of temples of Poseidon. Now, Gades, the ancient word that Plato mentions, is the old name for Cadiz, which is a city very near Doñana Park that was founded by the Phoenicians around 800 B.C. Also, the most famous Pillars of Hercules are the Straits of Gibraltar, which are just south of the Park of Doñana. So he makes a very compelling case. The second location is Malta, a place with many mysteries, arguably the most mysterious island on Earth. The thing about Malta is, it's probably the oldest culture in the Mediterranean, and Plato would have been familiar with it because Plato did a lot of traveling around 399, starting around 399 B.C. Malta has the oldest temples in the Mediterranean. The oldest temples in Malta are 1,000 years older than the Great Pyramid at Giza. So this is obviously a very old culture, very old maritime island culture, just like Atlantis, as Plato describes it. And apparently around 2500 B.C., the civilization was destroyed suddenly, quite possibly by a natural disaster like the sort that Plato describes. So Malta is a very viable candidate. Okay. The third place would be Santorini, the island off of Greece. Probably the favorite candidate of documentaries, things you see on the BBC, Discovery Channel, things like that. The things that are working in favor of Santorini are it has that sort of concentric ring shape. It's shaped like a donut almost like a bullseye. It was in 1967 a very sophisticated maritime city was discovered there under all the ash. And there was a fresco on 3 walls in one of the houses in this city of Akrotiri that a lot of people say mirrors Plato's description of Atlantis. It's a fresco of ships traveling between 2 cities. And the most compelling piece of evidence is that around 1600, Santorini basically blew sky high in a volcanic explosion that caused tsunamis that were felt all throughout the western Mediterranean. So you have a natural disaster for which we have a lot of evidence there. And the fourth place, which I have to admit I had no idea about prior to starting to dig into this, and which a lot of people have latched onto as the most compelling theory, there was a fellow named Michael Hubner in Germany who was an IT specialist, and what he did was he took every detail he could find from Plato and plugged it into an algorithm and weighted every bit of evidence for reliability. And basically his computer spit out what he called 7 sigma, or 99.9999% accuracy, that Plato's Atlantis had to be in a spot very close to what is now Agadir on the Atlantic coast of Morocco.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yep.
That is new. So of these 4, how would you rate them percentage-wise? Let's start with southern Spain. Just give me a percent out of 100.
I would say southern Spain is certainly high on the list of possibilities.
50%?
I couldn't put a number on it. I could, because there's nothing to measure it against.
Okay.
I would
Malta.
say, likelier than not, I could say, Malta, somewhat less so, but only because there's less evidence. Some have argued that when Plato said the Pillars of Hercules, which is such strong evidence for southern Spain, he meant the Straits of Messina. And if that's the case, the Straits of Messina between Sicily and the boot heel of Italy, then it becomes a much stronger candidate. So, a lot of it is interpreting Plato's original words. Santorini, it's the favorite among academics and such.
Yes.
To me, I don't know. There's something about Santorini that doesn't ring true, which is that Plato talked about earthquakes, and there was no earthquake in Santorini. It was an explosion, and Plato knew about volcanoes, so it would be surprising to me if he would mix something like that up. But there's a long story about how the story was transmitted that we can get into later. And Morocco, I would say, Michael Huebner, his case is very strong, but again, you have to weigh the evidence and look at how much emphasis he gives to every single piece.
But nothing close to North America in the Atlantis.
No, the thing about North America that, a lot of people mention North America, and Plato mentions in the Atlantis story, he says, Atlantis was on the way to other islands, and across the boundless sea there was a true continent. And a lot of people have said that means that people were traveling to the Americas, back and forth from Greece. It's possible, and I've heard some people talk about that in ways that are convincing. We don't have any evidence for it, first of all, and second, the thing about Atlantis being outside of the Mediterranean area is that it's a war story between Atlantis and Athens. So for Atlantis to be far outside of the Mediterranean area, it would have to be a navy that could provision itself and still be able to attack Athens, which is still at least a couple thousand miles from the mouth of the Mediterranean. So it just doesn't make that much sense to me that people would be attacking from across the ocean.
How did Plato hear of the Atlantis story?
Well, the way he describes it, and he says, I think it's 22 times in the Atlantis story, this is a true story, this is a true story. There are people who say, well, Plato is a very tricky writer. When he says it's true, that's just because he's trying to say it's actually false. It's a joke.
Yeah.
You can't win on that one. But he does say it's true 22 times. And he says that the story was transmitted by, I think it was his great-great-great-great-grandfather, a fellow named Solon, who's a famous Athenian. He's sort of the Thomas Jefferson of Athens. And supposedly Solon went to Egypt and around 600 B.C., and in some of the temples of Egypt, he saw what seems to be some sort of hieroglyphs. He says he spoke to a priest, and the priest told him the story of Atlantis because it was a story about the great bravery of the Athenians. And supposedly Solon brought this story back and kept it, and it was passed down to Plato. And I think he wrote the story around 360 B.C.
Okay, so the movies I've seen about Atlantis, Mark, showed high technology, a huge crystal that sank when the island sank.
Yes.
But they possessed incredible power, flying machines, all kinds of technology.
Yep.
Is that pushing it?
If you want to go back to the original source, yeah, I think it is. I think a lot of that stuff comes out of the readings of Edgar Cayce. It comes out of Madame Blavatsky. And those are visions that these people had, and they've passed along. When I explain to people why I don't put much stock in visions, I say, well, look, Atlantis is like a buried treasure. If you're going to go looking for buried treasure, do you want to use the treasure map that somebody found on one of Blackbeard's ships that crashed off of the Carolinas? Or do you want to use a vision that somebody had? I'm probably going to go with the treasure map.
Edgar Casey, have you looked at any of the things he has said about Atlantis?
I did. I didn't really find any evidence in favor of what he said. He mentions the Hall of Records, the Sphinx's paw, and stuff like that. People have done a lot of nosing around the Sphinx, but there's no Hall of Records there, as far as they can tell. There are interesting things going on. There's a theory that the Sphinx at one point was underwater, which is being debated. But I couldn't find anything that backed up Casey's ideas about a Hall of Records.
Do you think these 4 locations that you've been mentioning, that one of them is indeed Atlantis? Or are we missing something?
It's hard to say because we don't, unless you find, a sign that says "Welcome to Atlantis, population 2 million."
Not going to happen.
Elevation 200. I think that the 2 things that we could find.
We can't even find a plane, let alone
exactly. But I spoke to some guys who helped find the Bismarck and who helped find Flight 447 at the bottom of the sea. And they were explaining to me the kinds of underwater technology that are available right now. And they said, look, if the seas are right, we now have cameras that can spot a cinder block from a mile away under the water. So, the idea that other things will be found under the ocean, I think that's a very viable thing, that we will be finding, more ruins and things under the water. There's always going to be more that we don't know than we do know. And that's, unfortunate. And that's where people start to extrapolate and say, well, maybe it was this, maybe it was that.
Hey, Mark, when we come back, let's talk about the search for Atlantis. You mentioned some of this technology. Let's see what is going on that can really enhance the search. That would be an amazing discovery if they were ever able to find it. We'll be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Lots of events coming up over the next couple of months, but I'm coming back to Vancouver, Canada, British Columbia. I'm going to have a great time there. It's Saturday, June 6th, a major event there on stage. I've got many guests, exciting guests. Full information, if you go to our website, coasttocoastam.com, at the top or bottom, click Events, and then scroll down to the June 6th event in Vancouver. It's called George Norrie and Friends, a live stage show. Come on out. The tickets just went on sale a few days ago, and they're already going out the window or the door, wherever they go, but they're going. So come on by and say hi. Plus, we will have the meet and greet. And welcome back to Coast. Mark Adams with us. Mark, give us the geological reasons what would cause a landmass to sink into the ocean.
Well, the question is whether it actually sank. Like I said, Plato's description is not, an island sank. His description is an island was hit by devastating earthquakes and floods, and afterwards there was a shoal of mud where Atlantis used to be, where ships can no longer pass. So we're talking about something where there's obviously a landmass of some sort just below the water. Well, whether it was the whole island or not, he's not specific on that.
How deep were we talking?
That's a good question. Obviously, if ships can't pass, and we're talking about
big cruisers.
Well, he's
cruise line ships.
In 360 BC, we're talking about triremes and boats that are pulled by oars. I can't imagine there were many boats with a very deep draft at that point. So it couldn't have been more than 10 or 20 feet under the water, I wouldn't think. But that's another one of the clues about this.
Surely we'd be able to find something that's not that deep.
Well, that's the question. I mean, you mentioned the technology before the break. And I think, any sort of breakthrough is going to come from either of two directions, because things are improving under the water. I saw some 3D underwater video up at the Woods Hole Institute. Those are the people who found the Titanic, who found Flight 447. It was absolutely mind-blowing, the stuff that they can do underwater now. I don't know if it's fully available yet, but the stuff that they had just completely shocked me with its clarity. So I think we're going to be finding more things under the water. And the other thing is from above. I don't know if you saw this story last week where they found the White City in Honduras, which has been missing for 500 years. They now have a technology called LIDAR where they can actually search through the canopy of trees and look for stones and things like that. And this has been the big breakthrough in people looking for Atlantis. When Google put Google Earth up, suddenly, people had access to satellite images that had been, only known to a few people as insiders for a long time. And now anybody can look around the Earth for any sort of missing city that is in the back of their mind.
It's frustrating.
Oh, of course. But at the same time, it's so fascinating. If you read the original story that Plato told, there's so much detail in there that, the human mind is programmed to make up stories to explain things. So you start to read all this detail, and you even almost unconsciously start to think, this had to be a real place. And once you've turned that corner, the next question is, where was it? Of course. And everybody who reads the story does that.
Does Plato make reference to how many people might have been on Atlantis?
He does. He talks about the size of the army. And if it's true, he's talking about an army of over 1 million people, because he talks about this enormous plane and how many people live per plane and how many soldiers came from.
Did they all die?
Well, that's the question. He says, your armies were overcome in this earthquake, and he seems to be referring to Athens, but he's probably referring to Atlantis as well. So whatever this was, this is another thing. He's using the Atlantis story as a warning. He's saying, look,
it could happen again.
Yeah, civilizations, technologically advanced civilizations, they get fat, they get arrogant, and when they least see it coming, devastation strikes, and they're not prepared for it.
What if Plato was just a storyteller?
It's possible, but here's the thing. The placement of the Atlantis story comes between Plato's Republic, which is generally considered to be the most influential work in Western civilization. It's a brilliant work. It's a foundational text of both, Christianity and fascism. That's how influential it is. Right after the Atlantis story, the Atlantis story is actually sort of a preamble to a dialogue called the Timaeus. The Timaeus is Plato's attempt, and Plato was a mathematician. Plato believed in mathematical logic. Is his attempt to give a mathematical explanation for the universe. Also very influential work, arguably the most important work in the Middle Ages. So the idea that Plato would make up, and there's one guy who I read his work, and he tries to say, 2,000 years before anybody else, Plato invented science fiction when he came up with the Atlantis story. So the idea that Plato would invent science fiction and happen to stick it between two of the most important philosophical works of all time just doesn't ring true to me.
It's an amazing story, Mark.
Plato, he's such an interesting writer, but he's so slippery. He never comes out and says things. He hints at them. So, that's why Atlantis is still a mystery. It's a puzzle, and I think to a certain degree, Plato intended it to be a puzzle because he was using it to teach at his university. He founded the first university in Athens called the Academy. His prized pupil was Aristotle, who went on to teach Alexander the Great. So, this is one of the great learning institutions of all time, but he was using a mathematical curriculum, and I think there are things in the Atlantis story that he was using to teach this mathematical curriculum.
What if it got hit by an asteroid?
It's a possibility. Having looked at some of the modeling that people have done, if a comet did strike, this theory was considered laughable until the Alvarezes came up with their hypothesis about the dinosaurs around 1980. That the comet had hit the Yucatan Peninsula and not more or less knocked out the dinosaurs around 65 million BC. Looking at the model, what's fascinating about this is not only are there all these flood stories that seem to appear around the same time in ancient history, and not only are they all very similar, but if you had a comet, coming at the Earth at 100,000 miles per hour, superheated, lands in the Indian Ocean, and there's a crater at the bottom of the Indian Ocean that could be evidence of this having happened. You're going to have not just a huge splash like someone dropping a bowling ball into a bathtub. You're also going to have a huge amount of vaporized water going into the atmosphere. And, in the Bible they talk about 40 days of rain, 40 days and 40 nights. Well, you would have quite likely weeks of torrential downpours. And in the Atlantis story, Plato talks about rainstorms that hit Athens that are so incredible that they wash the dirt away from the Acropolis and leave just, I think he calls it, the bare bones of the land.
Wasn't Plato around when Pythagoras, Mr. Numerology, was around?
Well, what happened was, it was about 100 years later. Most people know the famous story of Socrates, who was Plato's teacher. He's found guilty of corrupting the youth of Athens. He's forced to drink hemlock to commit suicide. After that, Plato goes on what is sort of like a study abroad excursion around the Mediterranean. He ends up in southern Spain, which is where the Pythagoreans had their base, and he starts to study with a fellow named Archytas, who is like a king and also a Pythagorean philosopher. And it's there that he starts picking up Pythagorean ideas. The Pythagoreans believed, they had all sorts of strange ideas. You're not supposed to eat beans. You're not supposed to touch a white rooster. You're not supposed to leave your bedclothes unkempt in the morning. You have to put a certain foot down first and put your shoe on the other foot first. But their main belief was that there was almost a binary code behind the universe, and their commitment was to unravel this binary code. They believed, as Aristotle put it, he said they believe numbers are things, and they also believe that things are numbers, and that's where numerology started. They thought that, one had a certain personality and two had a certain personality, and that these gave off vibrations, and this had a huge influence on Plato. And, he taught a Pythagorean curriculum when he got back to Athens, and there are so many numbers in the Atlantis story that you have to step back and say, okay, are these numbers meant as, ancient GPS coordinates? Because he says, the canals of Atlantis are X number of stades wide. I think a stade is about 600 feet, and the plain is X number of stades wide and X number of stades long. Or is he using these numbers as, some sort of code to speak to his students? And, that's part of the mystery. That's part of the puzzle that we haven't quite unraveled.
Wouldn't it have been interesting to live during this era? All these people, philosophers, statespeople, just thinking about things when they had no technology, to be able to just come up with the things they came up with.
Yeah, I mean, this is a moment in time when, Plato talks about this in a lot of his dialogues. They're trying to grapple with a new technology, which is written history. And Socrates doesn't like it because you can't argue with written history. And, Herodotus is the father of history, and he comes just before Plato. One interesting thing I found out while I was working on this, there's a city called Heliki, I guess in Greek. It's on the southern part of Greece, on the Peloponnesus. This is a accepted fact that in 373 BC, this is one of the biggest cities in Greece. An earthquake and tsunami essentially bury this golden age city of Greece. So you've got the statuary, you've got the buildings, you've got everything from 373 BC, the absolute height of Greek culture. And they're looking for it now. And they think they may have found it. If they find this city, it's going to be like King Tut times 10. It's going to be absolutely mind-blowing.
Why do you think the Greeks were so advanced during that time period? I mean, you're talking about 300, 400 BC.
Yeah. It was just a flowering. And when we talk about the Greeks, we're especially talking about the Athenians. There were philosophers who came from closer to Asia Minor, what's now Turkey. But we're basically talking about the Athenians. And a lot of it was wealth and aristocracy, and they had a lot of time on their hands, and there was just this flowering of Greek culture in the 5th and 4th century. And of course, the downside of it, of course, was the Peloponnesian War, where you have Athens fighting Sparta, and a lot of that shows up in Plato's works as well. It was a very defining moment for him.
What did you find as some of your work in Meet Me in Atlantis that fascinated you the most, Mark?
I would have to say it was Plato's use of math and numbers. This was completely new to me, and I think it's completely new to most people who come to Atlantis. You know, I was talking to a professor of geophysics in Greece, a fellow named Stavros Papamarinopoulos, and he's probably the leading Atlantologist in the world. He hosts a triennial conference. He's written all kinds of very, very complicated papers. And I was trying to wrap my head around something that Plato had written. And he said, Mark, your problem is that because you don't speak Greek, you don't understand that Plato is not writing on one level. He's not just being literal. He's writing, words to tell a story. He's writing in a musical code. If you go back and count the syllables that Plato uses, you can actually see that it corresponds to musical harmonies, 2 to 3 harmony, 3 to 4 harmony, that sort of thing. And he's using mathematics, and he's trying to send some sort of message through his mathematics.
To who?
To his students. He's trying to teach Pythagorean rules, and all of this has fallen away for us, so we don't understand it anymore. So the question is, at some point, will there be enough computing power in the universe to try to crack this code that Plato has put into his story?
Was he a genius?
Oh, God. He's arguably the greatest genius of all time.
Could he, let's see, when was Pompeii?
Pompeii, I think, was that 79 BC or 80? I can't remember which. So at least a couple hundred years after Plato.
Okay. Yeah, 79 AD.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was way after. So
yeah.
It couldn't have been that.
No. I mean, there is evidence of, it's fascinating. Around 1200 BC, between 1225 BC and 1175 BC, there's evidence that there was this, I think it's called a seismological unzipping, where you see all these earthquakes and all these, other natural disasters around the Mediterranean. And it seems to have had a huge impact. Certain civilizations rose, others fell. Suddenly, it was utter chaos. And one thing that may have influenced Plato's story, making it a story about a naval battle, is there was this group called the Sea Peoples who came to Egypt out of nowhere. It seems like a sort of ragtag group of almost like mercenaries who arrived on boats and almost overthrew the mighty Egyptian empire around 1177 BC. And this is written about in the hieroglyphs in the temples of Egypt. So there's all sorts of strange stuff going on, and the reason why people now think that there may be some truth in Plato's story is that there was this fellow Schliemann, who was a German, who around 1870, against the advice of pretty much everyone in the universe, took Homer's story from the Iliad and said, you know what, I think this is true, and I'm going to go look for the city of Troy based on Homer's writing, and basically found it within a year.
The Romans, they were around for 500 years.
Mm-hmm.
They collapsed too. It seems like all these civilizations fail.
Yep.
What happens to them?
Well, two things can happen. It fails from within, or it fails from without, or, of course, some combination of the two. And that's part of Plato's message. He says, the Greeks were hit by something that made them lose written language at a certain point. He talks about Phaethon's comet coming and scorching the earth. He talks about these 4 great floods. So it's like, I think he says, at times like this, only the people who live in the mountains survive. So there's some remnant left behind to try to rebuild civilization. And I think that's a message that people forget about, especially when the nation is riding high, and that I think we should probably pay a little more attention to.
It's amazing how the Roman Empire, around the 117 A.D., their tentacles went everywhere.
Oh yeah, and seemingly insurmountable.
And seemingly, and then look what happened to them.
Absolutely.
They all fall.
The bigger they are, the harder they fall.
Will we ever find Atlantis?
I think we would have to find 2 things before we could say we found Plato's Atlantis. I think we would have to find some sort of inscription in Egypt, and it's not impossible. I think just last week they found some sort of new burial chamber. But if we could find some sort of inscription that describes, an island being destroyed, that would be half of it. And the other half would be to find some sort of city based around concentric rings. And this, too, is not impossible. If you look at the harbor in Carthage, in what's now Tunisia, one of the cities that Rome destroyed, that's concentric rings. So this may have been Carthage was founded by the Phoenicians. This may have been sort of, a Phoenician design. If we could find those two things, the rings and the inscription, I think we'd be a long way towards saying we found Atlantis.
Amazing. We're going to open up phones with you. Meet Me in Atlantis, the book by Mark Adams, modern-day explorer here. Mark, if people want to email you, how do they do that?
Just go to my book website, which is markadamsbooks.com, and there's contact info there.
markadamsbook.com.
Books, plural, yeah.
Oh, books. Okay. Spell it out for us.
markadamsbooks.com.
Okay, very good. We'll make sure we get that corrected. Mark Adams with us. We'll be back in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. You can always email me at george@coasttocoastam.com as well. And again, follow us on Facebook, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. We'll be back with your phone calls on Coast to Coast AM. Mark Adams with us. We're going to go exploring as we look for Atlantis, and you're joining us next on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back. Mark, we talked earlier a couple of years ago about Machu Picchu,
sure.
Atlantis. How did you pick these spots? I mean, what makes them so fascinating for you?
Well, it's funny. I mean, the great Leonard Nimoy having just passed away. I think it was watching that show In Search Of as a boy that sort of, turned some key in my brain. And there were also those great movies when I was a kid going to Catholic school, like In Search of Historic Jesus, In Search of Noah's Ark, Beyond and Back. This sort of gray area between, accepted science and pure speculation. And like we talked before about, the human mind starts to create stories to explain things. And as a reporter, I've always been drawn to people who are obsessive about things. My first book was actually about America's first great health guru who was trying to prove that the American Medical Association was a big fraud, and he was anti-vaccination and stuff like that, and actually almost got himself elected senator from Florida. So, when you find the greatest, most obsessive mysteries of all time, like Machu Picchu and Atlantis, and you have an opportunity to sit down and try to unravel these a little bit further, to me it's just absolutely irresistible.
Well, let me tell you, what you've done as an explorer has been fascinating. I don't think you'd ever trade it in, would you?
It's a great job. I really cannot complain. The idea that you can go out and meet all these fascinating people who've devoted their lives to, decoding these mysteries is just it's a blessing every day.
Would you ever like to go out and look for Bigfoot or, the Mothman or anything like that?
Bigfoot is kind of interesting because there is so much material on the Yeti.
Yes.
There's less on Bigfoot, Sasquatch, that sort of thing. But, there are, and this sort of parallels, Atlantis. There are old myths going back about, this creature in the Himalayas. And, it could be worth going back and trying to take a good, long, hard look at that and find out, as anthropologists say, what's the kernel of truth in here? This story was passed down for a reason. And what was that reason, and what can we get out of it?
All right, let's go to the phones here. Let's go to William in Madison, Wisconsin to get things started. William, take it away.
Yes, great show. I'd like to refer or bring forth an idea, a concept, and I want to ask the author what he thinks about it. There was a Proto-Finno-Ugric tongue that was spoken long ago, probably in North Africa or north of the Black Sea. The term Atlantis may mean Etela Lanten. Etela means south, Lanten west. In other words, it was a great civilization. Atlantis was a great civilization somewhere in the southwest. Egypt, Aikapitaya, timekeeper. Aiga's time, Pitayas keeper, and lastly, in the 1927 Encyclopedia Britannica, pyramid, the term pyramid, etiology unknown, but it may mean pyörä, wheel, mitta, measure. The stone pyramid with its shafts was built, not to rot, made out of stone, to measure the rate of flow, motion of time, the zodiac star patterns in the sky. All 12 of them take 25,920 years to make a complete wheel rotation in the night sky. Pyramid. So I want to ask the author, is there a possibility that these people who wrote about Atlantis may have spoken some kind of Finno-Ugric tongue long ago? It's a tough question because very few people know Finno-Ugric tongue.
You may be the only one, William. So let's find out. Mark, I don't know.
Hi, William. That's a good question.
He's our resident scholar, by the way.
Well, a lot of people try to look in ancient literature. They try to look for other references to Atlantis by that name. And the interesting thing is that Plato says when Solon came back from Egypt, he said, look, I've changed all the names that I was told and put them into Greek. So whatever the name was of the island that was hit by these earthquakes and floods, unfortunately, the only thing we know is that it was probably not Atlantis because the name was changed. In the Greek etymology of Atlantis, of course, coincides with Atlas, who held up the heavens. That's where you get the names of the Atlas Mountains and the Atlantic Ocean and such. So, ancient linguistics are a fascinating thing, but it's really hard to unravel from this far out.
We have next Brian in Montreal in Canada on the international line in Quebec. Brian, welcome to the show.
Yes, good morning. Interesting show. I was wondering if there's any possibility I heard a theory that a mid-Atlantic earthquake caused a tsunami that broke through what was then a landlocked Strait of Gibraltar and allowed the Atlantic Ocean to flood into the Mediterranean Sea, which had been at a much lower level until that time. And supposedly, as the story goes, Crete had been a mountain with Atlantis built around its base, but was all flooded with the rising of the Mediterranean. And I also heard that apparently there had been some evidence found of ruins of an advanced civilization at the base of Crete near the Mediterranean floor. Is there any possibility to think of there being any truth to that story?
Well, Crete is interesting because it's such an ancient culture.
And something Plato would know about.
Well, he would definitely know about it. You could sail to Crete. There was definitely exchange going on between Crete and Athens, which was a major port at that time. And Crete, of course, is the location of the Palace of Knossos, where the Minoans, are believed to have been headquartered. The interesting thing about Crete is that I think they found an axe there not long ago that was dated to 100,000 years ago. I mean, it's not an axe like we would use to chop down a tree, but it's an early tool. So there was some sort of development going on in Crete, in the Mediterranean, long before we've been accustomed to think. The thing about the Mediterranean is, there, as far as I can tell, from what I've read, there was a breach at some point, but it was probably a few million years ago, at which point, obviously, there would have been an incredible watery cataclysm when there was this breach, because the Mediterranean can go down several thousand feet in a lot of places. I don't know if there's any evidence that it was caused by a tsunami. I do know that I think there's a chunk of the Canary Islands that is sort of seismologically unstable, and someone has estimated that if that falls off, a tsunami at least 100 feet high will hit the east coast of the United States.
It's safe to assume, Mark, that wherever Atlantis might be, something very catastrophic happened.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And fast.
even experts who look at this, archaeologists and historians and such, they say, look, if there's one thing we can pull out of this story that we know was true, is that some sort of disaster happened and was passed down to Plato. We may not know the exact details of that, but it was something cataclysmic. It was something that destroyed civilization, and for that reason, it was necessary to be passed down.
And it happened quickly.
And it happened quickly, absolutely.
Didn't give these people much of an opportunity to flee or get away or anything like that.
No. What's interesting about it, I mentioned the city of Helike earlier that was hit by an earthquake and flood in 373 B.C. You sometimes, like before the 2004 tsunami, and I think I've even heard this about the 2011 Fukushima tsunami, was the animals running for the higher ground. Well, supposedly for 5 days before the disaster in Helike, every tiny animal ran out of town for 5 days before that.
Wow,
so this sort of evidence goes back a long.
They feel the vibration or something. That sounds like an earthquake.
Yeah, and it was. So there's these little bits of evidence that when you look at these old stories, you say, wow, that really does ring true.
The Greeks built some incredible classic-looking structures, buildings, sculptures. Might those structures like that be on wherever Atlantis might be, and they went down with it? And, so if you can get down there, you might be able to see a 20-foot statue of some type?
Well, it's hard to say because the buildings that we're familiar with, things like the Parthenon on the Acropolis, those are Golden Age structures, with the classic columns and the triangular pediment. What we may be looking for are, slightly less sophisticated buildings. If let's say, the story of Atlantis is based on this cataclysmic period from 1225 BC to 1175 BC, something happened in there. There are ruins from the Mycenaean era of Greece, which is before what was known as the Greek Dark Ages, when the Greeks lost written language and stuff like that. They are impressive, but they're not quite the sort of classic Greek architecture that we know from banks and the Supreme Court and things like that.
Let's go to Providence, Rhode Island. Hello, Tony. Welcome to the program. You're up with us.
Hey, great show. In The Silmarillion by Tolkien, there's a chapter called Numenor, and it's quite like Atlantis, where a giant fleet decided to attack an area that was forbidden for them to go to, and everything was wiped out by a tsunami.
Yeah.
And his tales are based on Norse legends mostly, and he was a genius as far as ancient tongue. And now they've discovered pyramids under the Azores near Pico Island. Are you familiar with those new discoveries of those pyramids?
No, I don't know anything about that, I'm afraid.
Oh, if you look it up, it's very recent. They found a lot of pyramids that are similarly aligned to the ones that are in Giza, which are, I think, the Orion constellation.
Oh, right. I have seen that there. I saw that in, I can't remember the guy's book.
Strange structure off the coast of Malibu as well, Mark.
Oh, really? Okay.
Underneath, under the water. It's a very strange structure. It looks like you can go in underneath the water, but it's weird. It looks like it looks like a convention center that sank to me.
Well, a lot of these ancient buildings absolutely do have solstice alignments and things like that. In Malta, in these temples that were built, between 3600 and 3200 BC is the best guess. There is a doorway where a shaft of light comes through, and I believe it strikes an altar of some sort. On the solstice, on the winter and the summer solstice. You can actually go to Malta and visit. They have a special visitation on that day at dawn. There could be something to some of these solstice alignments. And certainly, having spent time at Machu Picchu, that's the most incredible solstice alignment I've ever
Why hasn't there been a major scientific exploration to try to find Atlantis?
Well, the thing is, you're looking for a negative. You could.
But these ancient stories, there's always something to it.
Well,
it's like I believe there was Noah's Ark out there somewhere.
Sure, but people have poured a lot of money into looking for Noah's Ark, and they haven't really found anything solid yet. Then they say, well, because the boat was made out of of wood, and blah blah blah. The thing is, we don't know exactly what we're looking for. Unfortunately, so much archaeology discoveries are made because people stumbled across things. It's like when people first started coming across dinosaur bones, and ancient people thought that they were dragons. You have to stumble across a few things before you can start putting the pieces together. And unfortunately, with Atlantis, you'd have to basically survey the entire Mediterranean, and then you would have to survey a good portion of the Atlantic Ocean as well. And if you take in some of these other theories, you'd basically have to survey the entire ocean bottom. That said, I think, within our lifetimes, we may see some sort of serious, deep ocean survey being done, and those results will almost certainly pull things up that we never even imagined.
What if it's in the Bimini area, where Edgar Cayce, I believe, thinks it?
Well, it's interesting. I tend to discount that theory just because so much money has been
But it was Edgar Cayce, Mark.
Well, I know that. I know. But here's a thought. Let's say Cayce was correct, and he said, this would rise again in 68 or 69. It's possible he was talking about the rise again of Atlantis and the culture. 68 and 69 is when Donovan writes the song that you played at the beginning. It's when you look in major newspapers like the New York Times and even the New York Review of Books, which is one of the snootiest publications in the world, and they're writing about the search for Atlantis. So it's possible he was referring to this sort of reawakening to the idea that Atlantis could be found.
We go next to Phoenix, Arizona. Tom's with us. Good morning, Tom. Welcome to the program.
Hi, great show, you guys.
Thank you, Tom.
Very much. Quick question. Let me just. Okay, I want to verify something. Some authors define Egypt, the time in Egypt, as a place where people would go to have some kind of transformational experience, and then they would take that knowledge and go back out to other areas. Is this jive with anything you know about?
Well, I think what you're talking about may go back to, you remember I mentioned Ignatius Donnelly, the congressman?
Yeah.
This is a theory that's known as diffusionism or hyperdiffusionism, which is that some mother culture has a disaster, and then all of these wise people get on boats or whatever and go out and found great cultures around the world. Donnelly believed that Atlantis sank, and then people went off to found ancient Greece and Egypt and the Inca Empire, and basically any ancient society that was advanced. We don't really have any evidence for that sort of thing having happened. What seems to be happening instead is that people, develop things separately. They develop the wheel separately. They develop agriculture separately. So the idea of this mother culture that just sort of spews out people around the world, it doesn't yet hold a lot of water.
The Story of Atlantis. Meet Me in Atlantis. That's Mark Adams' book, available all over the place, of course. I love the cover. Who did this?
I don't know who the artist was. The publisher is Dutton Books, and they do terrific covers. Let me see if I can look it up quickly. But it captures so many of the elements of Plato's story. There's geometry in there. He talks about elephants on Atlantis. He talks about the disaster. And supposedly, the god behind all this is Poseidon, who's there with his trident right there. Julie Munn, I believe, designed by Nancy Resnick, illustrations by Julie Munn. So thank you to them. It is a beautiful cover, and I think it really does convey the idea of the book, that people have this obsessive nature, and they go out and they take the clues that Plato gave us, and they, now that they have this technology like Google Earth, they can do a lot of this stuff from home.
Well, they sure can. We will get more calls when we come back, but how long did it take you to study this?
It took me about 3.5 years to write the book, and it took me about 2 years before I could even begin to tiptoe toward trying to unravel this sort of Pythagorean numerology that Plato was dealing with.
And once again, for people who want to email you, they go to your website, markadamsbooks.com, correct?
Correct.
All right.
I'm getting emails right now, George.
Oh, yeah, they love you.
Yeah.
They love you. I'm getting emails about you, too.
Good.
And they are good, by the way. All right, let's come back and take some final phone calls in a moment with you on Coast to Coast AM. as we talk about Meet Me in Atlantis. Boy, I think it would be fantastic if they could ever uncover this place. On our next Coast to Coast program, split show for you. For the first couple hours, I'll be talking with John A. Gotti, the son of the late infamous mob boss John Gotti, and Peter Lance, Deal with the Devil. And then later on, Richard Belzer joins me, one of my co-authors in the book, Someone is Hiding Something, about the missing Malaysian plane. He joins us live for a couple hours as well, so I'm looking forward to that night. We will be back in a moment with Mark Adams, Meet Me in Atlantis, and your final calls. And welcome back. Mark Adams with us. Meet Me in Atlantis, and let's go to your final calls as well. Mark, by the way, I do want to congratulate you on your work. You're very thorough at what you do.
George.
You don't miss much.
Well, I find that if you come up with an interesting, intriguing idea and just dig and dig and dig, you can find fascinating stuff that also happens to be true.
What's your next mission?
I haven't decided yet. I honestly can't. Once you've done Atlantis, you're kind of looking down from the mountaintop.
How about looking for the Hall of Records?
See, there's just not that much to go on. All we have are some KC readings.
KC readings, that's right.
Yeah, so there's just not a whole lot of detail to go on.
God, if anybody could find that, well, that'd be great.
I mean, if it showed up, it would definitely be.
Let's go to David in Spokane, Washington, west of the Rockies. Hey, David, get us going here. Go ahead.
Oh, yes. George, I just wanted to make a couple of comments when you were talking about why civilizations collapse. I'm kind of an amateur Roman historian. I took a couple of classes in Roman history.
Okay.
And what's interesting, first, you said it was like Rome lasted 500 years. It lasted 1,400 years. When Constantinople fell to the Muslims, there was basically that was not it. There was still even a couple of islands that were basically Roman until they fell to the Muslims too. But as far as the fall of Rome and Greece, what's really interesting is there was a new study that came out, or a new book called Why Civilizations Collapse. And the number one reason why these civilizations collapsed was depopulation. Apparently, when the Romans came into the Greek peninsula and came into all the different Greek cities, some of the Greek cities were deserted, and the Romans, there was no fight, there was no war to take over Greece. They just marched in, and the Romans asked the Greeks, well, where are the people? And they said, well, people here just stopped having children.
Jeez, it's not like they fled; they just didn't populate.
They were puzzled by it because they didn't even have to make camps. There were so many empty buildings; they just stayed in the buildings in Greece. And then after they conquered Greece, whatever happened in Greece seemed to happen in Rome, because Rome, the families went from large families to your families that had the great villas and estates and whatnot. They would have just 2 kids. That would be it. And that couldn't sustain the empire, especially with legions. The emperor was desperate for legions, for all the enemies on the borders of Rome. But not only was there a problem with depopulation, but it was a problem with population. Depopulation was caused by 2 things. It was caused by they were all drinking wine, and the wine was imported in big vessels that were lined with lead.
Sterilized them.
Yeah, lead made them sterile. They just couldn't have children, and they didn't know it because at that time they just didn't have the science for that. And the other reason was the empire. As the empire grew, and it had all these isolated kingdoms and other civilizations. These were isolated civilizations. They had germs and bacteria. And what happened was people started traveling around, and they started bringing all these plagues. And the plagues would sweep through the whole empire, and they would kill as much as 10% of the whole population at a time. So the emperor, and stuff, was just doing anything he could for legions, and they basically kind of the civilization stagnated there for a while because they reached a point where the empire was so big they thought, well, there's no need to grow the empire anymore because they became Christianized, and they thought, well, God's coming back, and we're his people now. And
well, so, David, after the Romans and the Greeks fell, who replaced them?
The Attica, the Hun, and from the east. They were actually a group of people that the Romans were trying to incorporate into their empire. But for a long story, they were like far above Greece, around north of around Romania, up in that region. And they tried to incorporate them. They were from Central Asia originally, and but they were going to give them a huge province and Romanize them and stuff, but it didn't work. They incorporated them and used them to fight their wars for them, but as it turned out, the barbarians understood all the Roman weapons and military maneuvers. So when the Romans fought them, these barbarians, they knew all their techniques.
That's incredible. We learn history here, Mark.
I know. Catastrophe comes in many forms.
Amazing. David, thanks. Well done, by the way. Shoreview, Minnesota, first-time caller. Bob's turn on Coast to Coast. Hi, Bob.
Hi. Let me turn my radio down.
Sure thing.
Oops.
Yep, turn that down. And you come back.
Speakerphone, probably easier to hear.
There you go.
Yeah. Thanks for taking my call. I
sure.
appreciate it. I just got home from the hospital, and it was kind of a synchronicity. I have a book, Atlantis, by...
and were you visiting, or were you a patient?
I was a patient.
Were you doing okay?
I'm 85 years old, so I guess I can look forward to those hospitals.
Yeah.
Kind of a sudden thing. I was in church, in fact, in class. Anyway, that's not...
Well, you're okay, though. That's good.
Yeah, I'm doing all right. I'm just trying to stay awake. But I have a book by John Michael Greer about Atlantis. I'm just wondering if Mark has read that book, or if he's...
I don't know Greer's book. What is it? What is his theory or hypothesis?
Well, pretty much the same, just in great depth about what you say, and it's all hypothetical, I guess, so it can't be proved or disproved.
Nope.
Sure.
Nobody knows.
Yeah.
But, an interesting thing is that, Plato's work, the Timaeus, that's all speculation. A lot of people think that this dialogue that Plato wrote, which is the original source of the Atlantis story, a lot of people call it like the first work of astrophysics. Because he's talking about atoms, and he's talking about the entire universe, and he's talking about, the harmonies and the music of the spheres and things like that, and things that he couldn't possibly have known, he's speculating on. So, I don't think it's in any way a bad thing to speculate a little bit about what Plato was up to in Atlantis.
If Plato did not write about Atlantis, would we have known anything about it by this time?
I don't think so. I don't think we would have any reference to Atlantis.
Okay. So he was the one.
He is the one. He is the sole ancient source, sole recorded source for Atlantis.
So if you got in a time machine, went back and talked to Plato, what would you ask him?
Was it true or not? What's interesting is that it seems that even right after Plato died in 347 BC, his students were already arguing about whether he had meant it to be true or not. Aristotle, his most famous student, wrote things, some of which seemed to indicate that his teacher had been telling the truth, others of which seemed to cast doubt on it.
Really?
And there was a student in the next generation named Crantor, who's famous as doing the first great commentaries on Plato's works. And according to lore, Crantor was so convinced that the Atlantis story was true that he sent an envoy to Egypt to try to look for this inscription that Solon had seen. So, the debate goes pretty much all the way back to Plato himself.
This international show goes now to Quebec, Montreal. Mark, go ahead.
Hey, hi, George. It's an honor to talk to you, and I listen to you every night at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
And hi, Mark.
Hey, how you doing?
Mark
yeah,
to Mark.
Not bad. Hey, I don't want to talk about Atlantis. Okay, I know a lot about Atlantis. I read books and all that. In Montreal, they were digging to make a high-rise building downtown, okay? And as they were digging to make the foundation and whatever, they came upon a village, and they found plates and spoons and this and that, and they brought in the archaeological team to come and investigate, and let's put it this way, construction has stopped. I'm just wondering, Could it be that there are many places like Atlantis or whatever that have not been discovered yet?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's possible that Atlantis or whatever the original inspiration for the Atlantis story was, could be sitting beneath a golf course in the Western Mediterranean. Oddly enough, people tend to zero in on sites for Atlantis where nothing has been built, but in the way that the Mediterranean has been built up over the last 1,000 years or so, the chances are that something has been built on top of whatever it is we'd be looking for is very high.
What's more dramatic here, Mark, that Atlantis was a small little island nation that got inundated by a tsunami, or some huge continent that got blasted away by either an asteroid or even themselves?
Well, according to Plato, it seemed to have been both. It was an empire that had conquered much of the coast of the Mediterranean, but it also had this central city with the concentric rings, and guard towers and gates and temples and things like that. The question is, when he says it was destroyed in a day and a night, is he talking about the capital city? Is he talking about the whole place? He says there's this shoal of mud.
And who told him?
Well, according to him, it's passed down, 4 or 5 generations from his ancestor Solon.
Father to son.
Yeah.
I've got a story for you.
Well, part of the problem is that in one place he says he remembers being told the story, and in another place he says he had an inscription. And, Plato's not saying this himself. He's not writing as Plato. He's using a narrator, a character named Critias, to tell this story. So there's one more level of, removed from a direct narration.
Frank's in New York City. Welcome to the show, Frank. Good to have you with us.
Hi, George and Mark.
Hi.
Yeah, my question, I think it's like a few of them, if you don't mind. Quick, if you know about Lemuria, the other continent in the Pacific that supposedly, I think it sank. The second question, I know because I'm a Rosicrucian, but I'm not too advanced in there. They have certain records where there were certain priesthoods with certain temples and certain mountains in Atlantis. Does Mark know anything about that? And also, there's a quick thing from the previous, guest with the topic, out-of-body experience. When I had my out-of-body experience, I was 17. I was a bad kid, but it was for a week, and I saw like a blue and white light around my body, and like I heard like a buzzing sound. And I was able to move around, but by thought, and I was like floating like a balloon. So it was kind of like strange to me, but that's what I saw. I didn't see the typical tunnel with the white light and all. I think because I was bad or something. I don't know. But anyway, there's those 2 questions about the priesthood and also about the Lemuria, please.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know much about the Rosicrucians, so I can't address the priesthood.
What about Lemuria?
Or the temples. Lemuria can be traced back to a single hypothesis in, I believe, the 19th century, where a zoologist was trying to explain why you saw lemurs on both sides of the Indian Ocean. And he said, well, maybe there was a continent in between, which he named Lemuria. And pretty much every reference you see to Lemuria can be traced back to that hypothesis, which incidentally was thrown out shortly thereafter, but the idea lives on.
We need an exciting mission. Maybe James Cameron or somebody can go hunting for Atlantis, huh?
Well, Cameron does have that deep-sea challenge.
He's got that, and it would be a great film.
He just gave it to Woods Hole, so, who knows what could be found at the bottom of the ocean.
Gunnar, truck driving in Minnesota. Hey, Gunnar, go ahead.
Hey, thanks for taking my call.
Sure thing.
Matt, you ought to have him on as an interview sometime. He always got good questions for you.
Yeah, he is.
But, he stole my thunder. I read a book from Ruth Montgomery about the same thing, Atlantia.
Yes.
And Lemurians, and I was just wondering if Mark knew anything about that. And back to the other guy with the Empire.
Yeah.
I think that's what our Empire is doing right now.
Exactly, Gunnar. You got that right. Ruth Montgomery, of course, did a lot of great research about a lot of different things, Mark.
Yeah. I'm not really familiar with his work, but it certainly sounds interesting.
Her work.
Oh, her work. I'm sorry, Ruth. Yeah. Don't know it too well. I tend to focus on the people who are using Plato's original work more.
Plato must have been one of a kind during his era, huh?
Well, I got into this because I was writing a magazine story about the greatest thinkers of all time, and every single professor I called up, I said, well, can you give me the top 10 philosophers, and every single one of them said Plato number 1, Aristotle number 2.
Plato was 80, died in his sleep, I hear.
I can't remember exactly. I mean, even his death is a little bit murky historically, just because it wasn't recorded.
Well, you know what's amazing? I mean, they talked about the longevity of life, and that if you lived to be 45 during that period,
sure,
that's pretty old.
Sure.
But all these guys lived until they were 80, 83. That's amazing.
Well, Plato was a wise guy.
He probably ate well.
He probably ate very well. He certainly drank very well. He wrote a lot about wine. He wrote about the dangers of hangovers. He wrote on
the wine probably helped him, cleaned out those arteries.
It may have. Well, Mediterranean diet, George.
You got it. Let's go to Gary in Hawaii. Hey, Gary, thanks for calling. Go ahead.
Hi, George. A question for Mark, and it not necessarily Atlantis, but a few decades ago, was there not remnants of in the Caribbean? I believe, if my memory serves me right, in close proximity to Cuba, some building structures that were found underwater?
Yes, absolutely. We had a story on that. Linda Moulton Howe broke it on our show. There were structures outside of Cuba. Some people thought that's where the Soviet Union dumped their missile silos and things after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. But if anybody went down there, nobody reported on it, on what could be down there. And the couple that was going to go down and try to raise the funds to do that, Zelinskys, I think they were, they never got the money to do that. So there's something off of Cuba, Mark, but nobody knows exactly what's there.
Right, I remember seeing something vague about it, and of course there's also the constant search off of the Bahamas that hasn't turned up too much thus far. There's some sort of rock formations that seem to be natural, but some people thought that it was a ancient man-made road. But thus far, it seems to be a natural formation.
And there's that possibility that we will never find Atlantis.
Oh, don't say that, George.
There's that possibility.
It is possible. It's a high possibility.
I hope we find it.
God, I would love to find Atlantis.
But we need a full-fledged mission. Would you go on the mission?
I'd be the captain.
Well, I'd like that. All right, Mark, thanks. And once again, where can people pick up your book? Meet Me in Atlantis.
Any of your reputable booksellers. It's actually on sale as of right now.
I almost said Meet Me in St. Louis.
That's what the title refers to.
I love it. All right, Mark, thanks for being on the program.
George, what a great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It was fun. Great program tonight. And tomorrow, again, I'll be talking with John A. Gotti, the son of the late mobster John Gotti. And then later on, Richard Belzer, actor, author, joins me as we talk about Someone is Hiding Something, our work on that missing Malaysian plane. Today, they thought they found a little some kind of napkin or something with Malaysia written on it, but no confirmation on that yet either. For Dan Galante, Tom Danheiser, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonehood, Sean Ladesseur, Stephanie Smith, Chris Burrows, and George Knapp, I'm George Norrie, somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM. We'll see you on our next edition. Until then, be safe, everyone.